On the night of April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic was more than just a ship. It was a floating palace, the pride of modern engineering, and the symbol of human progress. Passengers dined on fine meals, listened to music in grand salons, and believed they were traveling aboard something unsinkable. But in just a few short hours, that illusion shattered. By the next morning, over 1,500 lives were gone, and the survivors were left to carry stories of terror, courage, and unbearable loss. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., most passengers felt only a slight jolt. Some thought it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Few could imagine that the steel giant was already wounded beyond repair. Water rushed into the lower compartments, and the crew quickly realized the terrible truth. The Titanic was going to sink. Panic had not yet set in, but time was already running out. For the people aboard, survival meant facing impossible choices. The lifeboats, only 20 in total, could hold barely half of the 2,200 passengers and crew. Even worse, many were launched half-empty because officers feared the boats would buckle under too much weight. As the icy water crept higher, families were torn apart by the brutal law of the sea. Women and children first. Husbands kissed their wives goodbye. Fathers placed their children in lifeboats and stepped back into the crowd, knowing they would never see them again. Third-class passengers faced even greater obstacles. Locked behind gates and narrow corridors deep in the ship, many never even reached the upper decks in time. They fought against locked doors, rising water, and the crush of desperate crowds. For them, survival was not only about finding a lifeboat, it was about escaping the very design of the ship that held them prisoner. As lifeboats began to drop into the black ocean, those left behind confronted the cold reality. If they didn't find another way, they would soon be swallowed by the freezing Atlantic. Some passengers tried to fight their way onto boats, others clung to debris, and a few even jumped into the water, hoping to swim towards safety. In the chaos, people pushed, pleaded, and prayed. The sound of the ship's band playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee" drifted across the decks, a haunting attempt to bring calm as the world around them collapsed. For those who made it into lifeboats, survival was far from guaranteed. The North Atlantic was bitterly cold, the temperature of the water just above freezing. Survivors huddled together in the small wooden boats, soaked, terrified, and staring into the blackness, listening to the screams of those left in the water. Some boats rowed aimlessly, others drifted, too afraid to return and rescue more for fear of being swamped. In those endless hours before dawn, survival meant enduring not just the cold, but the unbearable sound of thousands crying out, and then, one by one, falling silent. By the time the rescue ship Carpathia arrived at dawn, only 705 people had survived. They had faced a night of horror that would never leave them. Some carried guilt, haunted by the cries they could not say. Others carried scars of frostbite, starvation, or shock. But all of them carried the memory of how fragile human life had proven to be, even aboard the so-called unsinkable ship. The story of the Titanic is not just about tragedy. It is about the people who fought, endured, and in some cases sacrificed everything for others. Their survival was not luck alone. It was courage, quick decisions, and sometimes the heartbreaking will to let go so that someone else might live. Survival aboard the Titanic depended heavily on where you were when the iceberg struck. For first-class passengers, escape routes were clear, and stewards guided them quickly toward the lifeboats. Many were still dressed in evening gowns and tuxedos from dinner, clutching jewelry and personal belongings as if it were just another inconvenience on their journey. Some even hesitated to board the lifeboats, refusing to believe the ship could really sink. Their disbelief cost precious minutes that meant life or death. For second-class passengers, the situation was different. They had access to the decks, but without the same privileges as the wealthy elite. They moved quickly, carrying children in their arms, whispering prayers, and begging officers for a spot in the few lifeboats that remained. Survival for them meant fighting against the invisible line between classes, a line that in those final hours still mattered. But for third-class passengers, the struggle was brutal. Many were immigrants, chasing dreams in America. Whole families packed into tiny cabins deep in the ship. Locked gates kept them from rushing onto the first-class decks, and by the time barriers were opened, the lifeboats were already filling fast. Mothers carried children up dark stairways. Fathers carried suitcases that would later sink with them. Survival meant breaking free from the very system that had kept them in the lowest class, a system that now trapped them as the water rose higher. Then there were the crew. More than 900 men and women worked aboard the Titanic, and for many, survival meant duty before life. Some engineers stayed in the boiler rooms, keeping the power running so that the lights would not go out too soon. Others worked to pump water, knowing they had no chance of escape. Stewards guided passengers, often refusing lifeboat seats themselves, and the wireless operators tapped out distress signals into the night, their final messages echoing into silence. For these men, survival was sacrificed for the lives of others. Not everyone who lived that night found a place on a lifeboat. When the Titanic's stern lifted high above the water and the ship split apart, hundreds were thrown into the freezing Atlantic. Survival in the water was nearly impossible. At that temperature, the human body shut down in minutes. People clung to anything that would float: wooden doors, broken furniture, even each other. Some tried to swim, their voices calling out into the dark. Others prayed, whispering their last words as the cold pulled them under. But a few did survive. They fought against the icy water, clambered onto overturned lifeboats, and held on through the night. Among them was Charles Jaugen, the ship's chief baker, who had drunk enough alcohol to keep his body warm longer than most. He floated for hours until he was pulled aboard a lifeboat. Stories like his remind us that survival sometimes depended on the smallest, strangest details. In the lifeboats, survival brought its own torment. Some were filled with women and children who had never rowed a boat before. Their hands blistered as they tried to escape the sinking ship. Others drifted aimlessly, waiting for rescue as the screams in the water faded. Every survivor remembered the sound. Thousands of voices crying out in terror, then silence. It was a silence that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The lifeboats drifted in the blackness, tiny islands of humanity scattered across the vast Atlantic. For many survivors, survival was not a relief, it was another battle. The night was bitterly cold, and the wooden boats offered no shelter. Passengers huddled together for warmth, their clothes soaked, their teeth chattering. Mothers wrapped children in shawls, holding them close to shield them from the wind. Every gust of icy air cut like a knife, and every minute felt like an eternity. Some boats floated nearly empty, carrying only a fraction of their capacity. Survivors looked around at the empty spaces beside them, haunted by the thought of how many more lives could have been saved. Others were packed tightly, each breath filled with fear that the boat might capsize. Every creak of the wood, every splash of the waves was a reminder that safety was still far away. The cries of those left in the water echoed through the night. They begged for help, voices rising and falling, until one by one, they faded into silence. Survivors later said that sound would never leave them, a chorus of death that haunted their dreams for the rest of their lives. Some lifeboats wanted to go back, to rescue more, but fear held them back. If too many swam toward the boat, it could overturn, drowning everyone inside. The choice was brutal: stay alive or risk saving others and lose everyone. Most chose to remain still, their ears covered, their hearts breaking. Inside the boats, people tried to find strength. Some prayed aloud, whispering words of comfort. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had seen. The class divisions that had defined life on the ship began to fade in the lifeboats. First-class women sat beside third-class mothers, both reduced to the same fragile state of survival. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, thirst burned their throats, and the icy spray of the sea froze their skin. As hours passed, the survivors watched the Titanic sink lower into the ocean. Its lights flickered, sparks burst from its funnels, and then, with a final roar, the great ship slipped beneath the waves. Where moments before there had been music, laughter, and light, there was now only darkness. Survivors stared at the spot where it had vanished, unable to believe the ship that had been called unsinkable was now gone forever. The night dragged on. Many in the lifeboat slipped into unconsciousness from cold and exhaustion. Some died quietly, their bodies found slumped against the side of the boat come morning. Others clung to life with sheer willpower, telling themselves that if they could just make it until dawn, they would see rescue. And then, at last, the horizon began to glow with the faintest light of day. The survivors blinked into the gray morning, their bodies weak, their lips cracked with their hope rising. Out of the mist, they spotted a ship, the Carpathia, steaming toward them. For the first time in hours, their nightmare seemed like it might finally end. When the first lifeboats reached the Carpathia in the early morning hours of April 15th, survivors could hardly believe they were safe. The crew of the Carpathia worked tirelessly, hauling half-frozen passengers aboard with ropes and ladders. Some women had to be lifted with nets too weak to climb on their own. Children were passed carefully from hand to hand, their tiny bodies limp from the cold. As each lifeboat approached, a wave of emotion swept the decks. Some passengers collapsed into tears. Others stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and hollow. Survivors later described the moment as surreal, as if they had stepped out of death itself and onto a second chance at life. But rescue did not mean relief. Once on board, survivors were wrapped in blankets and given hot drinks, yet the trauma of what they had endured clung to them. Mothers cried out for children they would never see again. Wives searched the horizon for husbands who had stayed behind. Entire families were torn apart, some with only one member surviving to bear the weight of memory. The Carpathia's passengers, who had gone to bed the night before in comfort, awoke to a ship transformed into a floating hospital of grief. Survivors told their stories in broken voices. Some could not speak at all. The sound of weeping carried through the corridors, a chorus of heartbreak that lingered long after the lifeboats were empty. For the next 3 days, the Carpathia carried the survivors to New York. Those who had lived through the disaster Others sat together on deck, wrapped in blankets, staring silently at the ocean that had swallowed their loved ones. Others shared their stories with each other, piecing together the fragments of a night too terrible to face alone. Guilt became a heavy burden. Many survivors admitted they were haunted by the screams of those left behind. Some said they wished their lifeboat had gone back, that they could have saved more. Others carried anger at the officers who launched boats half empty, or at the system that valued class over human life. Survival, for many, felt like both a blessing and a curse. Children who had been separated from their parents clung to strangers, too young to understand the finality of loss. Women stared at the empty spaces beside them, remembering the husbands who had kissed them goodbye before stepping back into the crowd. And men who had managed to survive, often by chance or by breaking the women and children first rule, faced suspicion, whispers, and even shame. Survival had saved them, but it had also marked them. When the Carpathia finally arrived in New York, thousands gathered at the docks. Some were there to embrace loved ones who had survived. Others stood waiting, desperate for news of those who had not. Survivors stepped ashore as heroes to some, tragedies to others, and mysteries to many. Reporters swarmed them, demanding every detail of the unsinkable ship that had gone down. But behind the headlines and photographs lay the true weight of survival. Many survivors never fully recovered from the trauma. Nightmares haunted them, sudden sounds triggered panic, and the memory of that cold night returned again and again. Some could not bear to speak of it at all, while others told their stories so often that their voices carried both pain and defiance. For children, survival shaped the rest of their lives. Some grew up as orphans, carrying the loss of family they barely remembered. Others built their futures in the shadow of the Titanic, forever tied to the night that had nearly ended them. For the crew who lived, survivors' guilt ran deep as they remembered comrades who had chosen duty over life. The world, too, changed because of what they endured. The Titanic disaster forced new laws, more lifeboats on every ship, 24-hour radio operators, stricter safety drills. Survival meant not only living through the night, but shaping a future where such a tragedy might never happen again. The Titanic's story has been told for more than a century, but the voices that matter most are those of the people who survived. They remind us that survival is more than luck. It is courage in the face of fear, sacrifice in the face of loss, and the will to hold on when everything seems lost. For some, survival meant clinging to a lifeboat in the freezing dark. For others, it meant letting go of loved ones so that someone else might live. And for all, survival meant carrying the memory of that night, a memory that did not end when the ship slipped beneath the waves, but lived on in every heartbeat, every tear, every story told. The Titanic may rest on the ocean floor, but the survivors carried its legacy on their shoulders. Their suffering, their strength, and their survival ensured that the world never forgets what it means to endure the unendurable.